Hi, I'm Giles Bidder, and I do 101 Part-Time Jobs. It's a podcast.
This is MetaPod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them.
101 Part-Time Jobs is the podcast where I speak to bands and musicians about the different side hustles they've had along their way. And I'm this week's guest on MetaPod.
Welcome to MetaPod. Thanks for tuning in to meet my guest this week, Giles Bidder of 101 Part-Time Jobs. I'm Wendy, your MetaPod host, and I hope you're doing well and fine out there. MetaPod talks to creators of the web's most interesting podcasts and gets at the stories behind those podcasts. This week's guest, Giles, does something similar with his show, which explores the other jobs that musicians do alongside their work as artists. The result is a backstage pass of sorts to better understand what the minds, hearts, and hands of indie rock are doing when they're not on stage, on tour, or in the studio. Giles is thoughtful about artists as individuals and about the larger creative economy that they're part of. His DIY ethos makes him a great ally and advocate for musicians who want to create their own lifestyle or pursue work in non-traditional ways. 101 Part-Time Jobs will offer you thoughts and ideas about how musicians balance or blend work and art into a lifestyle, but it's also simply a good podcast for discovering bands you might not know yet, particularly if you're outside of England. In this episode, we talk about some of the unhealthy aspects of the music industry and what Giles' biggest wish is for musicians. It's actually fairly simple. It's also a very familiar sentiment expressed by others that have featured on MetaPod who are connected to the music industry. I also asked Giles for some of his most embarrassing work stories, a question that you'll regularly hear him ask the guests on his own show. So meet Giles Bidder of 101 Part-Time Jobs.
Great.
Cool. Should we just dig right in?
Yeah. Ask away. Let's go.
Giles, let's do it. Welcome to MetaPod.
Thanks for having me on MetaPod.
Your podcast, 101 Part-Time Jobs, is about work, but really it's also about music.
Yeah, it's about musicians who have traditionally always had to work by day in order to play by night.
There's so many music-related podcasts out there right now, so tell us what's special about this one.
Well, I played in a touring band for sort of 10 years. And even before my band was touring, I was in other bands as a teenager playing locally. And immediately I was hooked on that idea of running home from school and getting straight onto the computer to book gigs. And I was just so infatuated with that idea of making my own fun, making fun for me and my friends, to organize it, to take control. You know, I didn't want to go to other people's parties the whole time. I wanted to go to parties that we made. That just seems the most fun and the most, punk rock thing to do. But it could be any genre, really. But for me, it was punk rock. So that has given me the experience to understand what people go through in order to just play one gig a month, or to be a bar band, and to do music in all these different sorts of ways requires you to basically design your own life. And that, to me, is fascinating. And as soon as you turn 16 or 18 or however old you might be before you have to stand on your own 2 feet and you can no longer get away with staying at your parents' house or other people's houses, and you need to pay bills and taxes, that requires a lot of interesting thought and imagination. And what comes out of that are amazing stories of taking your life into your own hands. That's what I'm interested in. Stories from those times.
Why 101? Why not 3.5?
Well, when my band got a booking agent, I thought, that's it. I'm going to go on tour for the rest of my life. And moved back to a family member's house and was ready to go. And it was just, silence. We went on a few tours that year, but I ended up working about 15 different jobs across 10 months. And I remember getting home from one day when I was cutting concrete. I told this person that I could cut concrete with this pretty dangerous saw. Said that I'd done it before, so he let me do it. And I got home, and it was just a day where everything hurt, and I was wet, and I haven't packed any kind of overalls, or it's just kind of pissing it down in Devon. And I got back home, and I thought, what am I doing? I'm working all these different jobs, and if I give myself some credit, it was like, look, I've got to make fun of this, and I want to write about it someday. So that's where the idea came from. 101 part-time jobs just was a name that came into mind, because I thought I was going to work 101 part-time jobs, and I still might.
Do you have any interesting jobs right now that you want to tell us about? I mean, I think I've read that you've done radio, or you do radio still?
Yeah, I stumbled across radio at Soho Radio about 4 years ago. And Soho Radio is an amazing place with hundreds of different radio shows each month. And I got working there as a producer, and I was on Universal Credit, which is a bit like a government scheme to help people who can't find work. And I sort of fell into this very well-timed crack in the system where, because I was self-employed but not really making enough money, they could put me onto a scheme where I was gainfully employed on Universal Credit. So for a couple of years, I was just able, by sheer luck and timing, to work at a community radio station and, kind of be subsidized a little bit, a couple of extra quid, couple of extra 100 quid a month to pay my rent. So that's how I got into radio. I just stopped working at the Times Radio and Talk Sport, where I was scheduling and doing some sort of more a bit of editing, but more administrative duties. Mm-hmm. And I've just left that so I can focus on editing and being more creative, which means interviewing and coming up with ideas for podcasts and radio shows.
Is there a job that you'd like to try that you haven't yet?
I'd like to go magnet fishing. I mean, that's not really a job, but
you wouldn't mind getting paid for it, though.
Well, I think you get paid just from the experience, and as well as the little things you'll collect along the way down the canals across Britain. So I'd like to get into that.
You could do that here in Amsterdam as well.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I'm thinking canals are just Britain. Canals, more famously in Amsterdam. I think at the moment I'm just really excited about doing podcast and radio, because I don't really think of I'm not a traditional radio person. When you meet a radio engineer or radio presenter, there's certain qualities that are quite specific in what am I trying to say? I'm a bit loose to work in radio and podcasts, so I'm trying to find a space where I could live there loosely.
Well, you have a good mustache for radio.
Thank you. Cheers. It keeps us warm.
So tell us about the types of bands and artists that you talk about on the podcast, and what kind of ambitions do they have?
They're indie rock bands primarily. Okay. It goes into punk rock. It goes into, it all falls under alternative music, really. Usually guitar bands. And I speak to those people because that's my world. That's what I'm a fan of. Listening to all different kinds of music. I got more into sort of composer, soundscapey music recently. I've been listening to Andrew Wazalik, who's a Scottish composer who's absolutely fantastic. I'd really love to speak to him. And their ambitions really are to do exactly what they're doing in their own free time and focus on that. But it's really interesting, because you do meet people who are very happy in their part-time jobs, and they've got part-time jobs where actually, it doesn't fill them with dread, and they don't come home completely exhausted. There are lots of people who enjoy doing something different, such as being a barista, where they can, come up with ideas in their mind during the day when they're working, and come back and put that down on guitar or pen and paper. So really, everyone's different. And that's one of the things I've really been enjoying about it, because we all have preconceptions when it comes to ideas of how people operate, and we're usually proven wrong, which I'm very happy to.
Are there any specific characteristics that you've come to know as things that really, really influence people's stories about their music and work? I mean, is it age? Is it the locations people live, the gender? Are any of these things really important in particular? I'm guessing they all are, but...
In particular in their success or how they see success?
I mean, I'm assuming the location you live, whether that's an urban area or like a rural area, may affect your ability to have certain jobs or spend certain time creating. I mean, have you heard any stories that relate to that about where people live?
I think different areas can provide different opportunities. I think you can live in a village where they have a pub that's well attended, so you could work part-time at the pub, and then lots of villages where there isn't anything like that, and you'd have to be a farmer or work in agriculture to do something. I think it really comes down to making the most of what you have. I think in lots of cases, that what's there spurs you on to find more opportunity. I certainly think the way you grow up and have your formative years defines what you think is possible. I grew up in northwest London, where a lot of people's families before we were born had sort of worked in the city, made some money in the 90s boom, and then be able to buy a nice suburban house in the countryside. And what that gave us the opportunity to do was come into London on the weekends or weeknights and come to gigs and go home and not have to pay to go on the tube every time we wanted to see friends. So that was a cheap way to live. But I do think, I've lived in London on and off for the last 10 years, and where I'm living at the moment, I've really found ways to cut down on the daily my daily spending. I live in an area where everything's more or less on my doorstep, and there are friends down the road, so you don't have to spend money on the train, and we can hang out at each other's houses rather than going to expensive bars or coffee shops. So really, I think it's taking stock of what's around you and trying to use that to your advantage, really. And again, some of that requires a lot of imagination at times. I've spoken to people who live in the hills in Wales, where they really have to make an effort to get to Cardiff or Swansea or the nearest town. And whether that's hitching or whether that's coming up with a bit of a side hustle so they can get the 10 quid for the transport and to get new fresh guitar strings. Those are the kind of stories that I'm looking into. They're humanitarian stories.
And how about age? Do you notice any big differences with the age of the artists you're talking to?
I think the younger you are to get successful, the less you will be well equipped to deal with it later on in life, between making records and going on tours. Certainly, I want to speak to people who have had some adversity in battling, making space for their art. The music's changed so much over the last 20 years because we can make music from home now and make it from anywhere. And one amazing thing about that is that you do get older people making music. And, if you're a bit older, chances are you have a bit more cash than when you're 18 compared to when you're mid-30s. I still think there's an area of age between like 18 and 30 where you're more or less in that same position. You're sort of like a beached whale in a way, because you're a bit like, what am I going to do? Because so many of these junior jobs require you to have some kind of nepotism or some kind of, if you want to work in the city, in London or in New York, for example, all these internships, none of them are paying. I'm sure there are a few, but across the board, if you want to work in media, at least that's all my experience, is that you have to either come from a rich background, a wealthy background, or by some stroke of luck can stay on a friend's floor or find somewhere with cheap rent.
Are people hesitant to talk about their side jobs? And I put side jobs in air quotes there because really they're just jobs. But
Right.
I mean, why are people hesitant, or maybe they're not at all?
Yeah, people are hesitant. So
Okay.
many times, 1 in 3 people I speak to, you can tell they're a bit like, why are you asking me about my job? But I think it's a good thing to ask the hard questions. I just read an amazing book by an editor called James Brown, and he started Loaded magazine, which was the impetus for all these sort of, I mean, they became quite sour quite quickly, other titles that looked at quote unquote lad culture. But really what he did was realize that what him and his friends were doing, going to gigs, drinking beers a lot of the time, and hanging out on the terraces at football games and having fun and prioritizing fun, as Self-Esteem has said, there wasn't anyone writing about that in magazines. And a few things that he said in his excellent book that just came out called Animal House, is the journalists that the journalists that he wanted to hire there were people who wouldn't mind asking the hard questions, who wouldn't mind having a laugh, being a bit weird. And I certainly see myself in that category, not because of any other reason other than that's kind of who I am.
Okay.
My mum's an author, and she's an excellent author called Jane Corrie. And all throughout my upbringing, and when she left my dad, and it was a single parent household throughout me being a teenager, she was working in the kitchen, teaching creative writing. She was working at a high security prison where she was a writer in residence, which means she taught these people who'd committed incredible, awful crimes, incredibly awful crimes, how to write. And so I was seeing her doing all these different things, and in order to do that, she had to put herself in some what would be considered strange positions. And so I think that is part of my DNA. That's part of my nature to be interested in that kind of behavior and the way that we spend our time. I've just known forever that, I was always getting in trouble at school. I've never been able to hold down a proper job. When I say, I catch myself doing it, proper job, as seen by other people. But that sort of, the working a job for a number of years doing the same thing that wasn't creative was never going to be me. And so, maybe it's a self-reflection thing. Maybe it's me trying to make sense of myself. But I've going back to the question, asking difficult questions. I enjoy doing it. I enjoy reading it, and I enjoy doing it.
And what do you think your guests most enjoy about being on the show? What do they get out of it?
I think they don't really get a chance to talk about that anywhere else. I'm not sure if you get a band of 3 or 4 people, I don't think half the time they're spoken to each other about it. When I was in a band with 2 other people, we never really talked about it in that kind of explicit fashion. You're caught up in what you're doing that day to really be able to take stock. So I think I give people a chance to take stock and talk and ruminate about the way they're organizing themselves. I think you're almost sort of encouraged not to be organized in a band half the time. You put your organization in someone else. There's that tour manager tells you what to do, or there's that engineer or producer or record label who tells you what you're doing, or at least guides you. So I think people get to speak for themselves.
I think a recent episode of yours I listened to, and I cannot remember the band, but it struck me that they started out by talking about social media. There was quite a lot of discussion about TikTok.
Yeah.
And I mean, what strikes me as someone who's nearing age 50, that social media is work. It's a lot of work, and especially for a band. And yet people, I think maybe younger people I'm not sure if they see it that way. I mean, probably some of them do, but What do you hear in terms of that? It's kind of invisible work, really, that some people are doing, but it's part of their music and creative career.
For these bands that had existed for any time before 2013, they were not, given the weight of that work.
Yeah.
It's not even invisible. It's just, it's there. You have to keep up with your fans. You have to keep up with trends. But success is offered to you, or is held up like a carrot in front of you with something like TikTok. Going viral is aspired to. Parallel to that is the way that we're listening to songs and not albums. We've got Spotify, which is, funding world arms trades. We're kind of surrounded by the online existence, because all that social media, all of those businesses, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, they're all vying and they're all fighting for our time. They want to get every minute from our 24 hours going online, because that is like, YouTube doesn't operate as a profit at the moment, from my understanding. So they need to do as much work as they're doing now on top of what they're already doing. They need to do 100% more work than they're doing now, or get us to go on their platforms twice as much we already are now, for those companies to make money and to keep on existing. So that has a huge knock-on effect on these artists, where they're basically saying, well, if you're not on social media, you don't even exist. And so what that means day to day is that, say if you've got band practice at 4:00, you've been working from 9 until 3 or 9 till 5, and you've been able to get off early, then you've been working straight to band practice, come home at 7, 8 or 9, and then you've got to get your head into your phone and come up with some kind of original way to share your art.
Yeah.
And the key word there is original, because you can't just farm out content. You can have 20 tweets, but you can have one really good tweet. And that requires a lot of thinking, a lot of brain power, a lot of work, resources, money for itself. Look at any band who's doing a good job at communicating with their audience, and they've made these good videos, they've made this good artwork, they've made something that you can sink your teeth into. So yeah, I think it's been a steep learning curve, and not one that they wanted to make or experience for most bands. I think what it means is that people's imaginations can run, and you can make some amazing music videos. But I think for the most part, it's a total pain for bands who just wanted to play music.
Well, you need some extra motivation, which might not always be there, but for some people, maybe it is.
You need to develop your own tone.
Yeah.
I feel like as a journalist, I have felt that I have the need to get into Twitter and to get good at it and to be regular and develop my own tone on it, which I think I'm getting there. I try and make myself and my friends laugh, and that's my tone, is that if I'm tweeting something, it's something I more or less would say to a friend group on WhatsApp or whatever. So it does require, you're developing your personality.
Yeah.
For something that maybe you wish you didn't have to, but it's too late now.
You spoke with Doug Marsh of Built to Spill in one of your episodes, and his interview stood out to me in contrast to some others, because he seems to really be, he's, I guess you could consider established. Again, I've got a lot of air quotes this evening. No. He seems to be looking back at a time when he had to have part-time jobs alongside of music, and maybe he doesn't need to anymore. I'm not sure, but he mentions the sort of indie ideal that financial success is not really supposed to be a part of one's ambition as an independent artist. Do you think that's an outdated idea? Do artists still aspire, if that's the right word, to that?
I think making art and making money are in two separate camps, but I think they each exist every day. You know, you need money to buy your paints. If you're a painter, you need money to buy new guitar strings. I think really what it comes down to is that if you're still doing it, then you've been able to clearly keep on do it because you've got the slight financial success that you have. I mean, it's such a broad range of how much money people are making.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how much, you know, I think you can have two bands of a very similar size in audience, but how much money is each of their agent getting them when they're playing the same festival? You know, one band might be getting £1,000, where the other band might be getting 1,500.
Yeah.
I think someone like Doug March, where they have maintained that independent nature of everything they're doing, yet still, you know, at some point in their career had a couple of records on a major label, and they could float that money and use that money as a foundation to further, you know, their vision of being an independent artist. I think those people are really interesting because it's not just about money, it's the idea of identity and identifying yourself as an artist and not thinking, oh, I have to get a job because I should, you know, but instead of that, saying, no, I'm going to keep on what I'm doing. Maybe I'll do things on the side, but they don't really matter. You know, I'm going to do them. I'm going to do them to the best of my ability. And, you know, I'm going to do it in good faith, but really I identify as an artist.
Right.
That's what I find interesting about people who have a bit more experience under their belts.
Mm-hmm. And another episode I heard you say, and I'm pretty sure it was you, and I found this a really important idea that about the music industry in general, that the highs are high and the lows can be pretty low, and that it's kind of an addictive lifestyle business where you're using something, disposing it, and then moving on to the next thing. Do you think that there's a healthier way for the music industry to operate?
You're always going to have those highs of playing to a big crowd, and that night or the next morning, you're going to be cleaning up your dog's mess, taking them for a walk. I think that's part of the nature of it. I think when a band is making a record or an artist is making a record, there might be a day where all they do is make something that you hardly hear on the record, you know, because it's so low in the mix. But I think getting that balance right is going to be different for everyone. I think a big part of it is who you're surrounded by and your support network, whether that's friends or family or the people that you're working with. I think it really comes down to that communication element of it. In music, it's sad that there's so much substance abuse. There's still bands getting paid with beers, and, you know, all of that is seen as part of the lifestyle. I think that's one of the, you know, a big issue, talking about that balance. Because I think when you start off your young band, everyone's excited. I mean, you're playing gigs at places where the idea is that you go and have some alcoholic drinks and party. So I think there's going to be an identity of your art with partying. I think the experience and learning to balance that is got a lot to do with enjoying those high moments, but knowing that it can't be like that every day, and you should be healthy and you should be able to keep on finding inspiration, whether that's reading or keeping, you know, challenging yourself with finding new films to watch. I think that's where the potential balance lies.
If there was one thing you could change about the conditions that musicians and artists work and create in, what would it be?
It's getting paid, of course. You know, I think there's government subsidies in Canada and Australia that we don't have in England and lots of other countries. I mean, in Germany, there's ways you can put on a gig and hire out a venue, and the local government can help you out there. I think culture celebrates music. And so all governments have these big departments of culture, these ministries of culture that don't really do anything for music. So that's something I would change, to have a serious conversation on nurturing, developing artists, venues, recording spaces. There are so many people who are extremely talented, who are dedicated, who have huge discipline. And the thing missing there is just a little bit of cream to keep them afloat there.
Okay. And to wrap things up, I'd like to ask you a question that I've heard you ask some of your guests, and that's what's an embarrassing story from one of your jobs?
Oh, I've got so many. I mean, honestly, it's a bit of an everyday thing for me. Working at Times Radio, I put on lots of trails, adverts for radio shows that weren't on tomorrow, but I advertised them for tomorrow. One time at a great venue in Exeter called the Cavern, it's a fantastic place, and I went behind the bar after someone had made a mess on the floor, and I said, dude, someone had chundered, and I think I leave space for myself to be made fun of a bit. I don't mind being the fool guy. So lots of those sorts of stories where I've stuck out a bit like an idiot. This is a good question. Thanks for showing a mirror in front of me. I mean, when I worked at the pub, I'd smash 10 glasses a night. Like I say, it's kind of not huge mistakes I make, but it's ones where I just break stuff and I'm clumsy. So I've just kind of accepted that's who I am.
I like advertising radio shows that are on tomorrow, but they're not. Sort of. That would really confuse me as a listener of radio. And I used to do radio as well, so I kind of understand that it's kind of fun.
Yes, I mean, look, I didn't do it on purpose. It's extremely unprofessional. At the time, I felt, mortified. But, it's radio. It's not A&E.
Yeah, last question. If you could have anyone on the show, who would it be? Rod Stewart? Dolly Parton?
Oh, I think Mike Skinner from The Streets.
Okay.
Because when that first album came out, I think he was a bit older than he looked. He kind of looked about sort of 18. I think he was more like early 20s, and he'd moved down to London from Birmingham. And the reason I pick him, I'm not sure how many part-time jobs he did, but in every interview I've seen and read of him, especially from those early years, the way that he thought so much and so originally about, reflecting British society of young people at that time. Mm-hmm. He was just so smart and so clever and did it with a great sense of humor. And that's something that I really want to keep on reminding myself to this is supposed to be funny. Life's supposed to be a laugh. And I think when someone can take having a laugh seriously, those are the people I want to read about and hear about. Yeah.
Very good. Well, have you tried to contact him?
I have, only recently, only a couple of days ago, actually. So we'll see how far it gets. I think he just posted something on Instagram about doing a music video. So maybe there's a record on the way, but hey, it's not far out of reach. When I did an episode with Thurston Moore a couple of years ago, I hadn't done anyone that big before then. I don't mind reaching out and trying my luck. I think everyone should do that. You just need to be polite and not too intense, and there's absolutely no problem with asking.
I mean, I've asked you to be on MetaPod.
Hey, here we are, having a laugh.
That's right.
Now I'm still thinking about which job I've had where I've made a gaffe. I'm kind of I'm
it's
sure
going to wake you up this evening, I think.
I know, or a little bit later on, le spirit de l'escalier. So that's what they say when you want to have a comeback at the time, but as you're walking up or down the stairs after that conversation, that's when you think of the perfect thing to say. Le spirit de l'escalier. I'm probably not saying that right.
Well, Giles, this has been so fun. Thank you so much for coming on MetaPod and talking about 101 part-time jobs.
Thank you very much. It's fun to talk about. I mean, just like bands speaking on my podcast, I don't think you can think about your own projects too much. I think it's important to speak to everyone you can about your own project. I think when you say things out loud, you get a better idea of what you think.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Yeah.
Well,
hey, thank you very much, Wendy. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you. I wish you all the best.
Brilliant. It's been excellent.
Thanks again to Giles for this conversation. I really appreciated his introspection and remarks about getting a better idea about your own work by speaking out loud to others about it. You can find Giles and 101 part-time jobs on Instagram and Twitter. You'll find links in the MetaPod show notes. And hey, thank you for listening. I'd love to hear what you think about this episode or any other episode of MetaPod you've listened to. Please leave a rating or review where appropriate, or just drop me a note via social media. You can find MetaPod's social links at the website metapodshow.com. If you liked this episode, you might be interested to check out the MetaPod conversation with Ray Osher of Don't Quit Your Day Job, a podcast devoted to exploring the world of cover bands. That's episode 55 of MetaPod. And of course, there are many other episodes of MetaPod focused on music-related podcasts. So have a look to see if your favorite music podcast has been on MetaPod. If not, let me know what it is. And if you didn't like this episode, well, I suppose you might not even have made it this far, but sorry about that. Let me know where it all went wrong for you, and maybe I can suggest another podcast that you'd appreciate more than MetaPod. In case you missed it, I recently put together a list of links to merch and other stuff created by guests of MetaPod. If you're looking for a gift or would like to support an independent podcaster, check the MetaPod Support a Podcast by Buying a Gift list. It's a link you'll find in MetaPod's Instagram account at MetaPod Show. As always, thanks for listening. I really appreciate it. See you.
That's all for this episode of MetaPod. Thanks for listening. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at The MetaPod Show and subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. You can follow MetaPod on Instagram at MetaPod Show or visit our website metapodshow.com.
Aside from the theme tune, this episode of MetaPod was made end-to-end by me, Wendy Morrill. MetaPod intro and outro voiceovers by Zoe.